conference aims at allocating spectrum consistently across borders for 5G in the mid-band spectrum, known as special harmonization, and will also look to set the agenda for more 5G and 6G decisions at the next conference in 2027. The decisions made next week will have significant consequences on the US's ability to shape global spectrum policy, an area which Washington now recognizes as critical to US firms' ability to compete globally in 5G, 6G, and in other digital technologies. Today's event is particularly timely not only because it comes right before the World Radiocommunication Conference, but because earlier this week, the White House released its national spectrum strategy intended to guide the US approach at the conference. The strategy clearly identifies spectrum management as a priority for the Biden administration and lays out a whole-of-government approach to increase spectrum research and development and reassess how the government and private sector coordinate on spectrum. While the strategy does not name China specifically, this push to redefine spectrum management is motivated by China's own drive to promote different spectrum policies and alternate digital infrastructure and norms globally, prompting what the strategy calls the need to, quote, ensure US leadership in advanced and emerging technologies. So today's event will examine Beijing's aims in 5G, 6G, the role of spectrum, the implications if China were to continue growing its share of the global technology market, and how the United States should respond. So it's a lot to cover on a complex topic, and fortunately, we've gathered an incredible group of experts to discuss this issue. So now I'd like to hand it over to our moderator for today's event, Global China Hub non-resident fellow Nora Long. Nora is also a senior research analyst at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, focusing on China's science and technology ecosystem, artificial intelligence investment trends, and AI diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific region. Take it away, Nora.
Thanks so much, Dave. And thanks to the Atlantic Council Global China Hub team for convening all of us here, to have a fruitful conversation on this very timely topic, as Dave mentioned. I am very delighted to introduce Commissioner Brandon Carr, who is also very kind to offer his remarks and join us for a brief conversation afterward. Commissioner Carr is the senior Republican on the Federal Communications Commission, having served previously as the FCC's general counsel. Carr has led the FCC's work to modernize its infrastructure rules and accelerate the build-out of high-speed networks. His reforms cut billions of dollars in red tape, enabled the private sector to construct high-speed networks in communities across the country, and extended America's global leadership in 5G. Commissioner Carr, thank you for being here, and over to you.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you, of course, to the Atlantic Council for having me at this great event. I look forward to learning myself a lot from the panelists that will be on here today. I thought Dave did a really, really good job of teeing up one of the most important geopolitical issues that we're facing right now. Obviously, as an umbrella matter that has to do with China, a lot of Americans are very familiar with China's Belt and Road Initiative, where they're looking to expand out and exert and extend, frankly, their malign influence in countries and communities around the globe. The way to think about spectrum and 5G in particular is that it is effectively one of the key digital elements of China's Belt and Road Initiative. America's leadership in wireless on spectrum issues is vital, and it is part and parcel of America's own geopolitical leadership. The facts are very clear on this. When America leads the world on wireless, when we are freeing up spectrum, when we are authorizing providers to invest heavily based on the certainty provided by licensed spectrum, it puts a wind at the back of US government officials and allied nations as they head into, as Dave walked through, the World Radio Conference. This is a once every 4-year conference. It's sort of a wonky issue, but what people need to understand is this is where a lot of the rules of the road are going to be set for what wireless services can be delivered in which spectrum bands. In China, going into that, the CCP has a game plan for advancing their interests and advancing their values through standards and through different spectrum bands. So it's vital, as we are approaching the eve of the beginning of the World Radio Conference, that America stand and demonstrate strength and clarity in a concrete plan so we can continue to lead the world in wireless. If you step back, I'm incredibly proud of the work that America's wireless industry has been able to accomplish. Just look at the past couple of years. As COVID-19 struck and millions of Americans and people around the world had their life effectively moved onto the internet in many respects, whether it was educating our kids or working remotely or accessing telehealth. If you look around the globe, there was a tremendous spike in internet traffic, basically 30% growth in traffic. And to try to describe that in normal terms, 30% is about the amount of traffic growth that network operators would have expected to see over the course of an entire year. So we took a year's worth of traffic growth and we stacked it onto the network virtually overnight. And what happened? Well, in Europe and other parts of the world, including in China, they saw a slowdown in their internet services. In fact, in Europe, regulators there called up some of the big streaming providers like Netflix and YouTube and asked them to degrade, to down-res, to effectively throttle the quality of their stream because they were afraid that their continent's networks would break. We had no such fear here in America. And the reason is because in the last couple of years, particularly from 2017 through 2020, we saw unprecedented levels and cycles of investment in America's wireless infrastructure. The FCC, we modernized some infrastructure rules that enabled a lot of build out. But most importantly and most relevant to this conversation is we freed up spectrum. We moved in my first 4 years on this job with unprecedented speed on wireless. We freed up spectrum in the L band, the 2.5 gigahertz, 3.5, C band, 4.9, 5.9 gigahertz. We can go all the way through the list of actions that the FCC took. And that was a big deal. It allowed America to lead the world as 5G technologies rolled out. But we're facing a bit of a predicament at the moment. And that's why it's important we have this conversation. Right now, America is stalling out on its leadership in wireless. And you can see that in particular on mid-band spectrum. Right now, the US is trailing almost every other country in terms of the amount of licensed mid-band spectrum that's available. We rank 13th out of 15th by some metrics in the availability of this spectrum. On average, America is almost 400 megahertz, we call it, behind other countries. And when you look particularly at China, again, the comparison that matters the most for America's geopolitical leadership, we're even further behind than that. By some measures, China has 4 times the amount of licensed mid-band spectrum available than we do here for providers in the US. In America's current track, if we stick with it, we're not headed to narrow that gap at all. It's projected to stay exactly where it is, US continuing to be up to 4 times behind China in terms of spectrum availability. So America needs to change course, and we had actually a really good opportunity to do that this week. The Biden administration announced a new spectrum strategy that they unveiled at an event on Monday here in DC. I was eagerly anticipating that report, as many people were. It was something that was about 3 years in the making. And unfortunately, I was a little disappointed. When you look at the actual spectrum plan itself, it doesn't include any new spectrum in the near term for America's wireless providers. So we needed to close the gap, and we're not doing that at all. Now, some of the good things that are in the report, there are some process changes that I actually think could make a lot of sense. Historically, what we've seen the last couple of years, both in the Biden administration and in the Trump administration, is a lot of other federal agencies that happen to hold a lot of spectrum. Again, by some counts, they have 12 times the amount of spectrum in the midband that's available for America's private sector. They have been, in their own defense, pursuing their own goals, their own missions, their own agendas when it comes to spectrum. And there are some pieces of the Biden administration plan that hopefully return us back to the regime that the framework that Congress intended, which is for those of us at the FCC to decide what's the best and highest of use of spectrum and to allocate it that way. So I do hope that those portions of the Biden administration plan come to fruition. But where it matters the most, which is putting megahertz up on the board, the Biden administration plan falls a little bit short. And again, that's disappointing because as we head into work, it's important that we put a bit more wind at the back of the U.S. officials that are going to be negotiating and help them out as they engage in a issue by issue technical fight with their counterparts, including CCP counterparts. So the US knows the playbook here. We've done it before. Again, my first 4 years on the job, we moved a lot of spectrum out. And it's time that we refill the spectrum pipeline and actually get megahertz out there. And it's vitally important, as we talk about here, for US geopolitical leadership, particularly as it lines up with China. So I want to thank you all again for the opportunity to offer some opening remarks. I look forward to learning a lot myself from these panelists and to participating in the discussion to come. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that incredible remarks. I want to, before we get deeper into the conversation, I want to set the stage and maybe set the baseline a little for the audience at home, but also for the panelists here a bit later. I want to ask you, what is spectrum and why is it important for wireless technology, in terms of both the development and the deployment of 5G and 6G in particular?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, spectrum obviously are the wireless airwaves, effectively the oxygen that is necessary to power mobile connectivity in the country. And right now, we sort of categorize spectrum in 3 basic bands. We call low band spectrum, which has very good propagation, so it covers a large area, but it doesn't have as much capacity as other spectrum. On the other hand, you've got what we call high band spectrum, millimeter wave spectrum in some cases, that has a lot of capacity. You can move a lot of data very quickly, but it doesn't cover a large geographic area. And then you have mid-band spectrum, which fits neatly in between it. So as a country, we obviously need to have all 3 of those spectrum bands out there. In the area where we're seeing the greatest deficit for this country right now happens to be in mid-band. And one reason why it's so important, we talk about the geopolitical context, but just for connecting consumers as well. In fact, right now, America's wireless providers are taking significant market share for in-home broadband connectivity. And what do I mean by that? Well, historically, a lot of Americans felt like they could only choose from a cable provider or a fiber provider to get a high-speed connection to their home. But now with this additional spectrum we're bringing on the market in 5G technology, you can get basically fiber-like services directly to your home wirelessly, which can bring very quickly new competition. And that's what we're seeing in the market. So that's a good thing.
Thank you so much. I think that's really important information for at least everyone to know, because when we're talking about spectrum in particular, it's hard for us to not talk about 5G and other, next generation wireless technologies. And I think you hinted at the discussion of geopolitical rivalry and technology competition in your remark, and I wanted to ask you to unpack that a little bit more, so that we have a better understanding of how the United States views 5G competitiveness in comparison to how Beijing has been doing so in its efforts to shape the global norms and global standards of 5G and other spectrum policy. How are we doing compared to China as a competitor, and how are we doing compared to our peers, including South Korea and European countries as well?
Well, look, we're falling behind, and there's no plan, apparently, as announced this week, to actually close that gap. And again, if you just go back to the World Radio Conference, which we talked about a little bit both in the opening and in my opening remarks, China is heading into that conference, the CCP, and they are looking to achieve a particular goal in 5 separate spectrum bands. The US, in contrast, is only looking to advance its interest affirmatively in 2 spectrum bands. So we are going into this conference largely playing defense. Now, this isn't to say that I agree at all with all the 5 spectrum bands that China wants to open up for 5G or for the various use cases that would serve its interest, but it's to show that there's an imbalance right now. The CCP is pushing to advocate for their interest in these international communities, and the US is largely playing defense. So what we need to do in America is to set forth a concrete plan for getting specific spectrum bands in the marketplace. And I take this seriously. Look, I put out a speech in March of 2021 where I went through individual spectrum bands, and I said which ones we needed to move on in 21, 2022, 2023, and beyond. Still up on my website. It's a very handy way of actually coming up with a plan that would match both the pace and cadence that we moved on in America during the last administration, but also help us play catch up to where China is right now.
Thank you. I think it's very important to see how the US is going to laid out its agenda also at the World Radio Communication Conference as well. And one other point I want to touch on, and you mentioned this in your speech earlier, I wanted to take a look at issues at home, domestically speaking. From your perspective, what are challenges? I think you mentioned there are opportunities, and America has been leading in its ability to offer wireless connectivity. But at the same time, I wanted to hear more about domestic challenges that you see that we need to address in order to ramp up our U.S. competitiveness in wireless technology. I think you mentioned the quality of stream compared to European companies. There's no such fear in the United States when viewing Netflix and in other platforms. But average Americans would also say that there are, in different areas like rural America, for example, there's certainly, quite a need for fast connectivity. And I wanted to hear a bit more about some of the challenges that you see, as well as solutions attached to those challenges.
Look, we've been making some good progress when it comes to connectivity here in America, but there's no doubt that we're not at the point of raising the mission accomplished flag just yet. Again, the game plan is pretty simple. It's more spectrum and it's streamlining infrastructure. Right now, one of the biggest challenges you note is bringing connectivity to rural America. And one of the things that you'll see is that the more rural you are in this country, particularly out west, the higher percentage of land is owned by the federal government itself. And permitting, getting the approval from the government to build cell sites and other broadband infrastructure on federal lands has been a tremendous challenge. And there's actually been a number of bills and pieces of legislation that have passed Congress to try to fix it. Some have gone a little bit of the way, but there's more we need to do there. So streamlining infrastructure builds in this country, permitting reform would be a very big step in the right direction. And again, similarly, freeing up spectrum. Again, it's not just good for America's global leadership, but it's good for our leadership right here within our own country in terms of connecting Americans. Those are two issues on which we need to make a lot more progress on.
Thank you. We definitely we have a long way to do that as well. I would also be remiss to not talk about the national spectrum strategy, and both Dave and you have mentioned this. And you said you are disappointed in some of the number of provisions or sections in that strategy. I wanted to hear a bit more about what is the Biden administration's getting it right, as opposed to some of additional really concrete policy proposals you want to see in the future. If you can unpack that, it would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought the Biden administration's spectrum strategy, while I appreciate how much work and effort it took to get them to where it ended up, I thought it ended up being a pretty big miss from this perspective. The way I measure spectrum strategies is, as a threshold matter at least, a very binary test. Are you freeing up spectrum? And then if so, how much? Or on the alternative, are you not freeing up any spectrum? And unfortunately, the Biden administration's spectrum policy sort of failed out of the gate in the sense that it doesn't actually free up spectrum. Again, it has some interesting ideas for process reforms that I think could help. And it says that they're going to continue to study a number of spectrum bands over the next 2 years. But I think it would have been better off if we'd been able to come up with a plan, given the 3 years they were looking at it, that identified specific spectrum bands, specific amounts of spectrum in specific years by which that spectrum would actually make it into the commercial marketplace. Again, that's what I did in March of 2021 with the plan that I had. And so I think it's sort of incumbent on us now at the FCC to pick up the slack a little bit. And I think all of us should come together, either individually or collectively as a commission, and set forth an actual spectrum calendar. And I think that will help sort of right the ship and make sure that we're heading back in the right direction.
Thank you so much. And I'm looking at the clock, and we seem to be out of time. And this is a really great conversation, at least to kick us off for a deeper dive, for our panelists. Thank you so much, Commissioner Carr. And I look forward to seeing that FCC's calendar, spectrum calendar, if that ever.
You and me both. You and me both.
Thank you so much again. And up next, we have a fantastic panel full of experts that I'm really excited to to hear their insights and expertise on this topic. I want to introduce our panelists. Barbara Baffer has been with Ericsson for 33 years, working in a number of different roles, and is currently the Vice President, Government and Policy Advocacy. She has also served on many boards, including the Board of Directors to CTIA's Wireless Association Foundation, 5G America's Board of Governors, and the Board of Telecommunications Industry Association. Clete Johnson is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic International Studies and also a partner at Wilkinson Barker Knauer, and last served as a senior advisor for cybersecurity and technology at Commerce. Hosek-Lee Makiyama is the director at the European Center for International Political Economy, who has also covered trade and diplomacy for more than 20 years, including 5G security, state subsidies, investigations, Open RAN, and trade disputes. Evelyn Romali is a partner at Wilkinson Barker Knauer as well. She has led efforts focused on the intersection of technology and national security policy, broadband expansion, cybersecurity, and spectrum management. She's also last served as Acting Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications and Information, and as Acting Administrator of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. And also just a quick reminder to the audience at home, you can go to askac.org, and that is askac.org, to drop any questions that you have for our panelists here, and I'll do my best to get to all of them. No promise though. Well, we have a lot of insightful discussion or experts here who will help us understand what is going on when it comes to 5G and spectrum policy. But before that, before we get to the Q&A or from the audience, I wanted to take advantage of my position as a moderator to ask some questions so that we can kick us off here. So first, I do want to turn to Barbara with a big picture question, right? Both Dave and Commissioner Carr have talked about how the PRC has been seeking to bolster its capabilities, but also trying to push its national champions, both the domestic and international advantages in 5G or 6G, and also other advanced technologies, right? The U.S. also feels pretty strongly about this as well, feels the sense of urgency to ramp up our 5G competitiveness. So can you just help us understand this a bit more? Can you outline the conversation around the development of 5G standards and also network security? Like, what is your assessment, of China's efforts to set 5G standards at the international level?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me on this panel. One of the areas I think is interesting on the security side is zero trust architecture. And when we talk about telecom, it's critical infrastructure, and we're building it with a zero trust architecture. But what we're concerned about is a deviation in the standards. We have different standard setting bodies, and we're seeing some deviation with regard to zero trust architecture. So just as a quick background, in 2020, NIST introduced the term zero trust architecture based on 7 tenets of zero trust. So different telecom bodies have evaluated the zero trust architecture, such as the O-RAN Alliance. They looked at Open RAN based on this NIST framework. But we're now seeing the deviation, as I mentioned. So 3GPP has deviated a bit, and they've only decided that 4 of the 7 tenets would be used to guide the development of the wireless architecture. So they're doing 4 of the 7 tenets. On the other hand, ATIS, which is a standard setting body here in the US, they disagreed with 3GPP, and they published a report in July of 2023 saying that all tenets of the zero trust architecture are applicable. So you have this O-RAN Alliance saying we're doing all 7. You have ATIS saying we're doing all 7, and 3GPP is still re-looking at the 7 tenets of zero trust architecture. Here in the US, all the tier 1 operators agree within this framework, and that we should be doing all 7 tenets of the zero trust architecture. So when we work with our operators, we'll continue to build to the zero trust architecture, knowing that this will be a divergence with the standard in the rest of the world. So it's really, it's an important security standard, and it's an architecture that we feel very strongly about. So that's one area in particular.
I also want to ask you about your assessment of Beijing's efforts to shape 5G as well, especially with all of these different, international bodies that you mentioned.
Yeah, so I think Commissioner Carr did an excellent job in summing up the spectrum situation. They're very strong in mid-band spectrum, especially going into work. As Commissioner Carr said, they're supportive of 5 different bands, and the U.S. is supportive of 2, one which has already been allocated. If they go for the full 6 gigahertz band, they will have 700 megahertz more of spectrum, licensed spectrum. Well, they've already decided that. So, and then there will be other countries that will follow them. The ecosystem will grow because when you have other countries and it's economies of scale. I mean, this telecom market, it's all about scale and size. So they'll have other countries that will follow at 6 gigahertz. So all in all, they could end up with 1,200 additional megahertz of spectrum in the mid-band range, which is, Commissioner Carr said, this is where 80% of the development of 5G networks is in. It's in the 3 gigahertz band or 6 gigahertz. So it's really important, and I think as US, we should really focus on spectrum below 10 gigahertz, because that will give us what we really need in terms of deployment for 5G and for 6G.
Thank you so much. And I think, Evelyn, I do want to go to you next. We mentioned the importance of both 5G and spectrum. We can't talk about one and not the other. And the strategy also makes it really clear that wireless technologies like 5G and 6G will require additional spectrum resources. And we established that early on too. I often think of spectrum, as a fuel that enables greater development and deployment of these technologies. And with greater digital connectivity as well, we can have a wide range of internet applications, Internet of Things applications, for example. Took a look at, remote surgery, for example, in the healthcare industry, or self-driving car in the transportation sector, right? But with greater connectivity, when we look at cybersecurity in particular, there's also greater vulnerabilities as well, greater exposure to cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So can you help us make sense of the downstream effects of 5G and 6G technologies? In particular, I think I'm curious to hear more about the implications of Beijing's agenda to shape global 5G and spectrum policy, on these related technologies that we mentioned, especially those that rely critically on other advanced technologies.
Right. Yes, so great question. I think in the US, we realized early on how important technology is to our national security. And as I think as China also moved out on their own technology policy, they were very strategic in terms of looking at the landscape. Very early on, they looked to, for instance, the Southern Hemisphere to help them get connected with Chinese providers and Chinese equipment. They have national champions that are able to give very attractive pricing around the world to attract buyers to their products. In the US, we, again, knowing how important it is to have a successful technology industry, we were a little late, I would say, in recognizing how aggressive and assertive China was being in the wireless space. I think several years ago, we realized as 5G was starting to emerge that 5G and looking ahead to 6G were going to be absolutely essential to both our economic security within the US as well as our national security. And that if we wanted to secure our own 5G, 6G supply chain, that we needed to be paying more attention to what was happening globally in terms of what equipment was being supplied to the global marketplace. And knowing that equipment and who's connecting the global players really has an impact on our security. Because those who have a insider look at that infrastructure, they are able to in a way, impose their values on that infrastructure. It gives them a security leg up because they get to design the security for those systems. And so it was a light bulb that the US needed to get more organized and to look at this, the issue of 5G security more strategically. I think just recently, and again, you're asking why it's so important. 5G is going to be the lifeline, just as Commissioner Carr was saying, for our future. Connected cars, as you mentioned, smart agriculture, smart warehouses. AI is going to be important in terms of the combination of 5G and AI to really fuel the technology of our future. This is how, we can solve some of the global problems by the combination of AI and 5G. So much of our world is going to be connected and reliant on this technology. So the security of this is paramount. And so I think, once we realized that we really needed to be more aggressive in terms of protecting 5G supply chains, protecting 5G competitiveness and leadership in 5G, it took us a little bit longer to recognize how critical spectrum is in that picture. We cannot lead on 5G, 6G unless we are also being very strategic and making sure that our global partners are coming along with us within the bands, that we're harmonizing those. So just as Barbara said, we have economies of scale. We know that trusted players, partner players, US players are supplying this equipment, and that we know it's trusted, we can rely on it, and that our supply chain into the future is going to be resilient because we're not relying on a high risk or adversary nation to supply that equipment. So it's absolutely essential for our national security that we get this right. And again, making sure that our spectrum strategy actually supports where we need to go on 5G competitiveness is critical. And I think we are now making those connections, but it took us a while. And to see some other nations like the PRC moving out for us to really start to get aligned on our strategy here.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen reports and analysis on China's national champions like Huawei and CTE offering lower price 5G equipment to various countries who are willing to accept those. And with that, I would like to go to Pleat next. And speaking of analysis, you've written extensively on spectrum harmonization and technology competitiveness. And in your research on 5G competition, you touch a lot on the way in which China has been trying to establish this alignment between its own spectrum bands and the allocation at home, but also the way that the global spectrum bands are actualizing. Can you talk about why global leadership in spectrum policy and harmonization, why is this so important? I think I'm really trying to hone in on the importance of this discussion here, and specifically what benefits can China derive from all of these alignment and also leadership in global spectrum. And we're talking about some of other countries are trying to come up with their own spectrum allocations as well. And we starting to see more mid-band spectrums coming out from various countries. So what are we looking at here?
Oh, thank you, Nora, and thank you to the Atlantic Council and to Commissioner Carr and fellow panelists for participating here. And I just want to just generally agree with everything that each of the previous speakers have said, and then take a step back to talk about to answer concretely what I think is at stake here. I've had a number of discussions with all of our panelists, including my former government colleague and present live law firm colleague Evelyn Romali, and I don't think it's an overstatement to say that how this market and technical discourse goes in the coming years is an existential issue for free market democracy. I know that sounds like a big grandiose thing, but this is the Atlantic Council, and these are the types of ideas that I think we need to put on the table, and I'll explain why. Everything that Commissioner Carr and Evelyn and Barbara have said about the connection between spectrum and supply chain, the connection between spectrum and specific countries' approach to technology and position in a global market scale, not just market share, but shaping standards, shaping the way networks are designed. It's not just to put it very bluntly, it's not just about how internet and connectivity is architected. It's not just about the next generation of cell phones. As we've discussed, 5G is a totally different approach to connectivity, even before we get to 6G, which will take it to another level, that will dramatically change the amount of data and awareness that societies can have about everything that everybody in that society is doing. And so there will be more digital data available than exponentially more than has ever existed in human history. And there are two different ways that can go. And here's why we think this is so crucially important. That additional data and connectivity can lead to more innovation that solves more problems. It can lead to more expression that brings out more individual and community benefits, or it can trend in the direction of authoritarian control, and as exists in the CCP-led PRC now. Social credit scores, total information awareness about what people are, where people are, what they're doing, even what they're thinking. And we're in a period now where this is not an academic issue anymore. And this is why I say that somewhat grandiose statement about an existential issue for free market democracy. I think this is real. We're in a moment, particularly following with two hot wars going on in Ukraine and in Israel, where effectively the authoritarian states are allied in a way they have not been, certainly since the end of the Cold War, and arguably not even since World War II. China, Russia, Iran, and even North Korea are part of what is not necessarily a formal authoritarian alliance, but certainly a partnership and an alliance. And the approach that those four societies and governments, let me make that clear, the approach that those four governments take to data and connectivity is totally, completely different from the approach that the United States and its market allies want to take. It's about control, including information control and shaping the information environment, as opposed to innovation expression, dynamism, and solving problems like climate change and inequality. So that is, in my view, if we get to a point where, led by the PRC, the future connectivity in the world is shaped by the PRC and its authoritarian, wouldn't call them allies, but more supplicants. We're in for a very different world than what we've experienced since the end of World War II, where free market democracy was on the ascent. So that's I genuinely think that those are the stakes. So it's not just about this invisible natural resource of radio waves. It's about how future societies are governed. Will they be governed through free market competition and democratic governance, or will they be governed by authoritarian control?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing up the topic of free market competition and the value of democratic principles. So on that topic, I do want to go to Joseph next, because you are a political economist. You spend a lot of time thinking about state interventionism and again the implications of the free market competition. And I do want to touch on this tension between economic advantages and also 5G competition when it comes to when it is framed as a security issue. And we've heard that throughout the entire the past hour here. So with that, what kind of impact do you see the competition to shape global spectrum policy and 5G standard? What kind of impact does that have on Europe, on East and Southeast Asia, given the increased demand of greater digital connectivity in all of these regions?
Thank you, Nor, and thanks for Atlantic Council for having me, and thanks also to the previous speakers for their great insight. And I'm intent to say that I agree with, if not all of them, or at least 99% of them. I'm not sure what I can contribute to this discussion, but maybe I should take a step back and look at the headline of this event and talk about the mid-band for a bit and how this discussion looks to, let's say, America's allies in Europe and East Asia. And first of all, me as well as anyone else was shocked by the 1st of July decision taken by MIIT to allocate the 6 gigahertz band for 5G ahead of the IMTs. But I'm not sure how much mileage there is to look at it as a treaty law question based on whether the ITURRs are binding or not. Because I think if you take 2 steps back, and especially from the position of Brussels and the rest of Europe, you might actually very quickly come to the conclusion that both China and the US have made the decision ahead of the IMTs. So basically what I'm trying to say is that this looks very much like a proxy debate on whether 5G or future 6G should be licensed or unlicensed. And there are strong arguments, I would say, in Europe and elsewhere for both. Unlicensed networks offer great innovative redesigns, if you like, and that upends the industrial value chains and it encourages an enormous amount of innovation, and it would also support the convergence between the cloud and the OTTs and the MNOs, which is really ongoing, which makes it really exciting. And I would say that there are a number of players have really proven that you can build basically a telco by using a hypercloud and virtualized RAN. There are a couple of examples of that actually taking place, and this is really exciting. But being a little bit more pragmatic and less academic, as Cleet said, there's a huge organizational and regulatory challenges combined with unlicensed spectrums and Wi-Fi-like solutions, and whether that could actually substitute licensed telcos. And after all, building a substantive public network of high quality infrastructure, especially using trusted vendors and trying to achieve universal service, require a lot of capital that usually comes with a licensed telecom business. And also, we shouldn't forget that the standardization and R&D, not least the work that takes place in 3G, PP, and elsewhere, requires a lot of capital that probably needs a licensed network as well. And not least for smaller, medium-sized countries, there's a certain amount of fiscal income that comes from the public authorities, that comes from the spectrum auctions. So there are a number of arguments both for and against, but ultimately, I think it comes down to whether you support either side. It comes down to which part of the industry you're better to. I mean, do you support an industrial policy that supports hyperclouds or European MNOs? And basically, it's interest versus interest rather than values against values. And I would say that we have had this discussion before. I mean, it's almost like revisiting the competition between WiMAX and LTE during the 4G years. And in this case, I think the carrier adoption was really decisive in basically favoring LTE over WiMAX. And I'm not really sure history, if it repeats itself or if it even rhymes, or maybe if we should say in telco speak, whether it roams. But the real question here, I think, is whether it should be an open choice by the market or it should be dictated by government mandate. And here's where I tend to be a little bit cynical because it's part of my trademark, but a lot of people in Europe looking at Europe and probably looking at the question and see that China and the United States are on the same side of that fault line. They just happen to advocate two different outcomes, licensed versus unlicensed, and against market choice. And that's perhaps a little bit concerning. And also coming back to the question around China, if I just may say one word here, is that I don't believe China is basing its power based on norms and values. It's sure, I'm not even sure if a communist, especially the Chinese brand, actually has norms and values, but they certainly have their interests. And I'm not even sure it actually helps the discussion to talk about China as like a monolith that is unbeatable, because if you look at the details of things, Europe and the United States are actually still world leader on 5G innovation, and not least on the R&D front. But where China actually beats the West currently is sheer market size. 50% of the 5G RAM market is in China. And if the customer is king, if there is a buyer's market, then it is the China's market. And that's actually not by cheating. It's just because they spend more money on this than we do. And that's fundamentally the problem, I think.
Thank you. And I do, I think we really leave a lot of food for thoughts here. Kind of wanted to bring all of these points together and pose one big question to all the panelists here. We talk about, we touch on a lot of points, including 5G innovation. We talk about equipment, supply chain resilience. We talk about, different market shares, the role of industry and government as well in shaping this. What would you conclude from this, right? Should we be thinking about, should we be thinking about spectrum leadership and 5G leadership at different levels in terms of, how we are able to innovate in the technologies field? How are we able to provide different equipments to countries that need, and come at a low cost as well? And also market share. How each companies and vendors, suppliers are having a stake in this as well. I know it's an open-ended question, but I would love to hear your reaction to others panelists' remarks as well. Anyone want to take the first stab at it? I'll go ahead, please.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Noor. Sorry.
No, I was gonna pick on Barbara because of her role at Ericsson, but you can go ahead. No, absolutely.
Yeah, no, Barbara, I think that's a good place to start. If you're up for it, I'm also happy to jump in, Barbara. You go
Yeah,
ahead.
thanks very much. And Osaka, that was very thought-provoking, your remarks, so thank you for those. I was thinking when you mentioned market share in China, one of the areas that is going gangbusters in terms of 5G build-out is India. And I think we really need to take a look at India and seeing how, I understand that they're building out 5G faster than anyone. And even though the ARPU in the market is low compared to the US, I think that market is one to really watch and see how they're building out their 5G and how that's being very successful.
Yeah, I think that just to puts on Barbara's point, very significant. And when we think about scale, I think the way to think about it is you know, China starts off with I want to be specific, the PRC starts off with a 1 billion person plus captured market. That's a very that begins with large scale. But what we in the US and our market democratic allies have is collective scale. I mean, you put together North America, Europe, the free market democracies of North America, Europe, Korea, Japan, Australia, India. Barbara is absolutely right. That's collectively an enormous market. And then there are a whole host of other markets throughout the world. So to go to Hosuk's point, I don't think we should assume that we're behind and that China is inexorably going to predominate here. I don't. In fact, I think we're ahead right now, and we being the free market democracy, rule of law part of the world, are ahead in very important ways. And also, I think just constitutionally more ready to win in a dynamic free market competition environment, because that's the way our societies have been designed, for at least 80 or so years. So to Hosuk's other point about values, I think he's absolutely correct. And when we think about the principles of free market democracy, it's important for us to not be complacent or naive about how hard it is to maintain those principles, and how, in many ways, the principles of rule of law and fair and free markets, competitive markets, and law-based, Republican, democratic republics. This is not throughout human history. This is not the normal. This is not the default setting of humanity. Usually, the default setting is authoritarian. Whoever is the strongest directs the way the society is operated. And so, those values that we bring are values. They're not just power. And we need to really focus our spectrum strategy around, as the world becomes more and more connected, making sure that those values are front and center at what the connectivity brings.
And I would just add that I think, at this particular point where we are in history, Clete talked about, the two global conflicts that are very heavy and serious and underway. This increasing tension between authoritarian states and free market economies, coming much more to a head across the globe. I think, I talked about the US being a little bit slow to pull all the threads together in terms of a 5G strategy that also was recognizing the need to be strategic on the spectrum side as well. But, that the fact that we were is a testament to what Cleet and others have been talking about, which is we do put the free market economy ahead. The U.S. is not, does not think in terms of industrial policy. And in fact, for so many decades, especially in the technology space, looked to the market to really help to, level the playing field. But I think, we are in a different environment right now with global conflicts, with how much of our society, our critical infrastructure has become dependent on technology and networking and the wireless and mobile environment and connectivity. We are all connected all the time. Our machines are now connected. As we look to the future, that wireless connectivity is the innovation and that we're all moving forward towards for the success of our economy as well as our national security. And so I think, on the U.S. side, from a policy making perspective, made the realization that because of this, again, the reliance, the need to be resilient. If you look at these global conflicts that we're talking about, where technology has become weaponized, right? What happens as part of the conflict? Well, you perhaps shut down the connectivity, you block supply of another critical infrastructure, perhaps using technology to do this. We know how important this connectivity is. And so, you can see over the last several years, the US taking more of a what starts to look more like industrial policy, right? But I think that's because of a earnestness, a recognition of the world that we're moving towards and living in now, and the need to make sure that we are defining our own future. As Cleet says, I think there is, a sense too that through our global partnerships, partnering with other market democracies, that we can still continue to let the market really, not picking technology winners and losers, staying neutral in terms of tech neutrality. But I think there's, if we look at the global situation realistically right now, that governments are going to be engaged on technology policy now and the decades to come because of how much we are relying on it for just our day-to-day security and economy.
Thank you. I do want to throw in a question from the audience. We talked, we've been framing this as a competition between democracies and authoritarian regimes. And there's one question that touches on the topic of that. So the question is, China's been making a ton of efforts in other countries through its telecom equipment providers like Huawei. We'll talk about that. The audience is asking, wouldn't the U.S. benefit by developing products that could potentially compete with Huawei? How is it going to do that in other parts of the world like the Middle East?
Maybe I can say something. So Ericsson's in 180 countries around the world. We compete head to head with Huawei and ZTE. In this country, we don't because they're not here, but they're a competitor, and we compete head to head in many countries. So it's we do compete with them, and we compete strong.
And I think just to follow on what Barbara is saying, exactly, Ericsson is one of the leaders. There are other what I'd say the USG would consider not to be high-risk providers. Ericsson being one, there are others out there, Nokia, Samsung, others. The US has also, over the last several years, as part of its 5G security policy, also been an advocate for open radio access networks. Again, they view that as a path to also diversifying, as opposed to feeling the need to, build a single US champion again that would go, for instance, to compete head to head with these trusted providers that are already operating, to focus more on competition, to work with allies so that they know and are thinking about their supply chain security when they make decisions about who they're going to bring in their country to offer national networks, to make sure that they're thinking about it, working with trusted suppliers. And in terms of the vendor diversity focus that the USG has had as well, to make sure to be working towards a competitive environment so that trusted providers and even with open radio access networks as well, giving more opportunity for more diversity in wireless networks, that is the way to continue to improve security, because that's taking a competitive approach as opposed to trying to necessarily think that just one US provider is what the answer is here. It has to be a global market. We started there. Telecom for the market to be successful, we have to be working together with our partners. So that is the strategy that the USG has followed over the last several years.
Yeah. And I think this one question might be directed at Hotak, but others, please feel free to jump in as well. The question is, if China's investing heavily in radio access network technologies RAN for use for at home and also abroad, shouldn't the US be doing the same thing? A ton of US RAN technologies importing from Europe. I don't know if you have any reaction to this question.
Well, I'm happy to answer that. And actually, the couple of the two previous questions, if I may just to say a couple of words, because we moved on before I got to say something. There's one thing that troubles me a little bit, that I do agree there is a conflict, open conflict and competition between the great democracies of the world and authoritarian governments. And there is also a competition in the telco space. I'm not really sure there is a mileage in conflating these two, to be honest. We talked about industrial policy, and I think it is fairly legitimate to say that the US wants its own players more than it wants trusted vendors. In the same way that, let's say, China wants to have its own AI industry, or Europe used to have pipe dreams about its own GPS satellites. That's absolutely fair. But the truth is that if you look at the Open RAN consortium, which consists of both US and Chinese players as well as European vendors, but it's largely US-China dominated, it is coming to a market where 250 networks have already deployed around the world. And we have, at best, 1 or 2 trials that is not yet reaching commercial stage. So it is deeply troubling in the sense that, yes, Ericsson, Nokia sounds like strange members of ABBA, but they are actually more American than Europe if you count where the researchers and then the engineers are placed. I mean, I think each of them actually hires more US engineers and spend more money on R&D in the United States than the indigenous US telcos. So yeah, US wants its own players in the same way that China does. And that's absolutely fine. I mean, that's the part of the world, that's the kind of the nature of industrial policy and the definition of how we see market outcomes and our interests today. So that's the first point. And I think as I said before, we are all fighting for our own interest here, and I'm not really sure we can say the definition of 6G can be, and the discussion we had on 6 gigahertz is really going to be dictated by freedom versus authoritarianism. It's basically a question about two business models. One that is based around existing competitive advantage on the cloud, and the other one around the public telecom infrastructure. And if you divide the fault lines as such, Europe and the United States is going to end up in two different ends. My hope is that we're going to see a lot of transatlantic mergers and more industrial cooperation between US, European, Japanese firms. Because if you look at it, if you're going to master 6G, you're going to need expertise in services, telco, and cloud. And currently, there's only one political power in the world that masters all three. That's People's Republic of China. And whereas United States and Europe is holding at most one or two cards. So yeah, I think you get a very different answer to this question depending on who you ask. But if you would ask a Huawei executive, I think they will say that the current market developments are very interesting, where Europe and the United States are fighting each other. And one of them actually even said to me, to my face, that there is a white man civil war, not perhaps an expression that I would have used, where basically Europe and the United States are fighting each other for dominance.
Yeah, go ahead, Barbara.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for that comment. And with regards to we're in the U.S. and we're in the U.S. big. We have 8,500 U.S. employees, we have 6 R&D centers, and we have our 5G factory, where we're making all of our baseband units for the tier 1 customers in Louisville, Texas. So I mean, when we're manufacturing here, we're Buy America, Build America compliant, and we're very big in the U.S. And so when some of the smaller domestic competitors say, you know, oh, we're a foreign company, just look at what we're contributing to the GDP in the U.S. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say, Barbara. And the similar, if different in the details, stories can be said about other large multinationals whose global headquarters are based in U.S. allies like Fujitsu, NEC, Samsung, Nokia. All of those companies have global headquarters in countries that are now defense treaty allies of the United States. But each of them are also very large American companies, meaning brick and mortar and human resources in the United States. And I think, Jose, you have raised some really insightful points, you know, about the various cards, if you're holding all 3 cards or just 1 or 2 cards. The thing that worries me about what I think you're right about this divide. It's a long time divide between Europe and the United States that is kind of like geostrategically kind of a competition among allies. But I think if we don't recognize the stakes here and recognize that Europe and the United States have, and the companies that are organized under those countries' laws, and the same goes for Japan and Korea as well, is the companies that are organized in rule of law based market democracies are fundamentally different entities than companies that are organized under authoritarian governments. And there's a lot of detail that you can play out in that, but it's effectively a difference between fair competition and predatory mercantilist approach to markets. And so those are the stakes, I think. And that we say this in a number of both CSIS and other settings, that the real issue here is not U.S. domestic versus foreign. That's kind of an old and I think outdated way to look at technology. It's really about rule of law based market democracies versus adversary authoritarian governance. And I do think that has an effect about the impact of the technology. in the end. It doesn't, it doesn't change the way necessarily the way the networks are designed, but I do think it has a significant effect in how the effects of the technology play out in societies. So anyway, just a foot stomp for market democracy, ally and partner based companies and facilities.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to think about the role of, industry players in the conversation around tech competition, global competitions as well. So as they also find themselves in the middle of, 2 or multiple countries. With that, thank you so much to everyone who share your insightful thoughts. And thank you for folks online as well for tuning in and submitting your questions. We have a lot of great discussions, great topics, and I think it's very important for us to continue to track, especially the conference next week. What exactly is going to played out in the next couple of weeks or so during Thanksgiving as well. So hopefully everyone's able to track that during your time off. But thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.